and welcome to the landmark 75th episode of KRAD COVID Readings. I've written a lot of stuff. I really didn't think I was going to still be doing this after 75 stories when I started this back in the spring, but that's 2020 for you. Anyway, for this particular installment, I want to read one of my earliest stories and one that was extremely well received. It was a novella, actually, called Horn and Ivory. Now, in 2001, Simon & Schuster did one of their big novel crossovers that they'd been doing since the mid-90s. This was called Gateways, and it involved the Iconian gateways, which were first seen by that name in the Next Generation episode Contagion, and also used in a Deep Space Nine episode To the Death. And these gateways belonged to an ancient civilization known as the Iconians, and they were able to go from place to place without need of a ship. They could just walk through the gateway and wind up on another planet. The miniseries also postulated that the device that sent Kirk's Enterprise many thousands of light years away in the episode That Which Survives was actually an earlier version of an Iconian gateway, and that the people of that planet were also Iconians. So that was able to bring the original series into it, and we worked on a whole bunch of other things. Anyway, I wrote the Deep Space Nine novel, and then the conceit of this particular series was that each of the first 6 books, which included the original series, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and then 2 of the novels-only series, Challenger by Diane Carey and New Frontier by Peter David. And each of those ended with the captain character going through a gateway, not knowing what lay beyond. And then there was book 7, which was called What Lay Beyond. And in each of those, the captain character goes on an odyssey. Now, my Deep Space Nine novel, took place after What You Leave Behind, after the last episode of Deep Space Nine. So several of the characters are not there. Sisko has gone off to be with the Prophets. O'Brien has gone off to teach the Academy. Odo has gone back to the Great Link. And Kira is now in charge of the station. And Nog is the chief of operations. Ezri Daxon, Bashir, and Quark are still there. And Ro Laren, formerly of Next Generation, is now the chief of security, replacing Odo. And a bunch of other characters. Anyway, there's a new first officer, a Starfleet officer named Elias Vaughn, and so on. Anyway, this story, what happens is Kira does step through a gateway and finds herself not only displaced in space, but also in time, as you will see. So this is Horn and Ivory. By the way, Nana Visitor, who played Kira, read this story and really liked it, which made me very happy. Anyway. Chapter 1. The axe nearly took her head off. Its wielder was large by the standards of the Lerrit army, but she still stood half a head taller. The plate armor he wore on his chest was too small for him, and it slowed him down, making it easier to anticipate his movements, and therefore just as easy to duck the attack. That it still almost decapitated her spoke to how long she'd been fighting. How many hours had they clashed on this grassy plain just outside the capital city? She'd long since lost track. But however long it was, the fatigue was taking its toll. Her muscles ached, her arms and legs cried out for respite. She ignored the pleas of her limbs and fought on. The axe-wielder probably thought the sacrifice of movement was worth the protection his armor afforded. The problem was it only covered his chest and groin, leaving his arms, legs, and head exposed. Still plenty of viable targets. So as she ducked, she swiped her staff at his legs, protected only by torn linen. She heard bones crack with the impact. The staff was made from a kava tree, so it was as hard as they came. And the Lerrit soldier went down quickly, screaming in pain at his broken leg. She stood upright and surveyed the battlefield. The smell of mud mixed with blood combined with the faint tinge of ozone left from the morning's rainstorm to give her a slightly queasy feeling, but she fought it down with little difficulty. As they'd hoped, the Lerrit army's formation had been broken. As last stands go, she thought, this is pretty weak. The war had been all but won on the seas, after all. Lerrit had lost all control of the port, and without the port, there was no way they could hold the peninsula, even if they somehow were able to win today. Based on the number of Lerrit army bodies on the ground, that wasn't going to happen. She caught sight of General Torna Antoso, the leader of the rebel army for whom she fought, and who looked to be the victor this day. As she ran toward him, one man and one woman, both much shorter than her, both unarmored, came at her with swords. She took the woman down with a swipe of her staff, but the man was able to strike, wounding her left arm before she could dodge the blow. Gripping the upper part of the staff with her right hand, she whirled it around so that it struck her attacker on the crown of his head. He too went down. Tucking the staff under her injured arm, she put pressure on the wound with her right hand and continued toward Torna. As she approached, she heard the reedy sound of a horn. Torna, a wide-shouldered bear of a man with a full red beard and bushy red eyebrows that encroached upon his nose ridges, threw back his head and laughed. "They retreat!" he cried. She came up to his side, and he stared at her in the eye, easy enough as they were the same height. "We've done it, Ashla," he said, his yellowed, crooked teeth visible from in a smile behind the beard. "We have driven the last of them off." "Yes, we have," she said, returning the smile with her perfect white teeth. The nickname Ashla, which meant giant, was given to her shortly after she joined the rebel army, since she was taller than all of the women and as taller than most of the men. Torna's words were prophetic. The horn was indeed the sound of retreat. The Lerrit soldiers who were able ran as fast as they could northward. No doubt they were returning to the base camp that Lerrit had set up on the other side of the hills that generally demarcated the border between the peninsula and the rest of the mainland. Raising his own axe into the air, Torna cried, "Victory is ours! At last! We are free!" The remaining soldiers under Torna's command let out a ragged cheer. Next to him, KRAD did the same. Chapter 2. The meeting room needed a paint job, but at least it didn't smell like a charnel house anymore, Kira mused. A particularly brutal battle had been fought here when the rebel army took over the Capitol building. Even with the tide of war turning, the building was still the most heavily guarded, and the fight to take it was a brutal one, with excessive casualties on both sides. But someone had done their job well enough to make the place habitable, if not aesthetically pleasing. The meeting table had been scrubbed, the chairs repaired, and the floor, walls, and ceiling washed. Looking around at the assorted happy but tired-looking faces in the meeting room, Kira wasn't entirely sure what she was doing here. It was, after all, for the high-ranking members of the rebel army. At best, she was a soldier, hardly what anyone would consider important. And she didn't want to become important. She'd done enough time traveling, both voluntary and involuntary, to know the risks. Flexing her left arm, Kira winced slightly. The wound from the sword had been long but not deep, and was proving maddeningly slow to heal. Unfortunately, Deep Space Nine and Julian's infirmary wouldn't be built for many millennia, leaving Kira to heal naturally, just like when she was in the Resistance. Her tendency to scratch at her wounds and not give her body a chance to heal properly hadn't changed with age. In fact, she remembered a snide comment Shakar had once made about how symbolic it was that Kira always picked at her scabs. Kira had met most of the people in the room only once or twice. The ones she'd gotten to know thus far were Torna and the tiny, short-haired woman who entered the meeting room last, Natlar Riceland. "Thank you all for coming," she said as she approached the seat at the head of the table. "Please, everyone, be seated." It soon became apparent that there were far more people than chairs by a factor of 2 to 1. With a smile, Natlar amended, "Or stand, whichever you prefer." Soon enough, many were seated around the table, with the rest standing against the wall. Kira was among the latter. Torna, though, sat in the seat opposite Natlar at the foot of the table. Her expression serious, Natlar said, "I hereby call to order the first meeting of the Perikian Republic." A cheer, much less ragged than the exhausted one Kira had participated in on the battlefield, met that pronouncement. Periki Romaro had first agitated for independence against the oppressive Lerrit regime years earlier. The nation of Lerrit had ruled the peninsula with an iron fist and a hefty tax burden, and though she was not the first to desire the removal of their yoke, she was the first to say so publicly. Periki had died soon after she began that agitating, hanged by Lerrit authorities. Her cause had lived on, and now was finally victorious. "I always wondered how the Perikian Peninsula got its name," Kira thought with a smile. As Natlar went into the dealings of what needed to be done next, Kira found herself tuning out. She had been to plenty of meetings just like this. Hell, she'd led meetings just like this. But those meetings were far in the future and, paradoxically, in her own subjective past. She saw no reason to involve herself now. She stared out the window, seeing the people of the capital city, which no doubt would also be renamed at this meeting, rebuilding their homes and places of business. The window faced south, so she could also see the docks and the large port beyond the city, the true heart of the peninsula. Docked there were several warships armed with massive cannons that carried the flag of the nation of Endtree. Kira turned back to the table just as Natlar was saying, "Admiral Inna, once again, we thank you for all that you have done for us." Inna Morent, a short, stout woman with salt and pepper hair, severely tied back and braided, nodded her head. Kira noticed that she gripped the edges of the table, no doubt a habit from a life aboard a seafaring vessel, where the surface beneath her feet was never steady. "We simply follow the road the prophets have laid out for us," she said. Kira's eyes automatically went to the Admiral's right ear, which was adorned with an earring. Though it was nowhere near as elaborate as those worn by Kira's time, Kira knew that it symbolized devotion to the prophets, a way of life that had not become as widespread in this era as in hers. Kira wasn't completely sure how far back she had gone, but based on the clothes and weaponry, it had to be over 20,000 years in the past. Which means, she thought, the first orb won't even be found for at least 10,000 years or so. Still, though no Lerrits she saw wore earrings, a few from the peninsula did, as did most of those from Endtree. And of course, Kira, though a believer herself, didn't wear one either, thanks to a decree by a religious authority that did not yet exist. The Admiral's comment elicited a snort from Torna. "I doubt that the prophets were the ones who put those cannons on your ships, Admiral." A chuckle spread around the table. "Be that as it may," Natlar said before Inna could reply. "I am afraid we have more business with our neighbors in Endtree." Inna seemed to shudder. "With all due respect, Prefect." Kira blinked. She had missed Natlar's assumption of that title. "I'd rather leave any other business to the diplomats and politicians. I was happy to aid you in casting out those Lerrit leeches. Their shipping tariffs were an abomination, but whatever further relationship there is to be between our governments, it is not for me to arrange. I would simply like to return home and await new orders." "I, however, would rather you did not return home just yet." Natlar folded her hands together. "While General Torna has assembled a fine army, and one I would pit against any other nations in the world, we are still vulnerable at sea. Lerrit does have a navy of their own, after all, and the moment we lose the protection offered by your fleet, they will return and take us back with little difficulty." "Perhaps," Inna said cautiously. Kira knew that tone of voice. The Admiral knew that Natlar was absolutely right, but to admit it would mean going along with something she did not want to do. "I therefore would like to request that Endtree leave a delegation of 5 ships behind to protect the port." Torna slammed his fist on the table. "Prefect, no!" "Is something wrong, General?" Natlar asked, her tone never changing from the reasonable calm she'd been using all along. "We've just fought for our independence." "With our help," Inna added with a small smile. Sparing the Admiral a glance, Torna said, "For which we thank you, Admiral. But if we allow them to stay here, we become as dependent on them as we were on Lerrit. We'd be exchanging one oppressor for another." "My people do not oppress, General," Inna said sharply. "The prophets—" "I'm fully aware of your people's religious beliefs, Admiral. They don't change the fact many worship the prophets," Natlar said. "It is not a reason to dismiss Endtree as a potential ally." "I still think—" "General, can we adequately defend the port with our current forces?" Torna grimaced. "Given a few months, we can assemble a fleet And until that fleet is assembled?" Kira winced in sympathy for her friend. She understood all too well the difficulty Torna was having. Some things never change, she thought. Inna was speaking now. "One of my ships is setting out for home with a full report at first light tomorrow. I will include your request, which will be put before the Council." Nodding, Natlar said, "Thank you, Admiral. General Torna will serve as your liaison to me, and should the Council see fit to honor our request, he will continue in that duty." Torna stood up. "What?" Before Torna could argue further, a young girl came in. "Excuse me, but 3 men are here claiming to represent the Bajora?" Kira blinked. "Just when I thought this couldn't get more interesting." Natlar barely hesitated. "Send them in." To Kira's ear, well used to the nuances of politicians, the prefect sounded relieved that her argument with Torna had been interrupted. For his part, the general sat back down, but glowered at the prefect. Kira knew Torna well enough to be sure that he would pick up this argument sooner rather than later. 3 men entered. They wore red robes that reminded Kira a bit of those of a Vedic in her time, though these were shorter and tighter about the sleeves. They also wore earrings in their right ear. "Greetings to you from the Bajora," said the one in the middle, the oldest of the 3. "Do we have the pleasure of greeting Natar Riceland?" "I am Prefect Natlar, yes." All 3 bowed their heads. We would like to extend our respects to your provisional government, and Torna stood up.
There is nothing provisional about our government. We are the Perikian Republic, and will be treated with the respect we deserve.
The envoys looked a bit nonplussed at the general's outburst. Good, Kira thought. They seemed a bit too obsequious to her. My apologies for my imprecision in speech. Regardless, we do come to you with an offer.
Really?
Torna said with a laugh.
The battle has been won less than 3 days, and already the Bajora have sent their envoys. Were you flown here by Remlabird with this offer?
General, please, Natlar said in her usual calm tone, but it was enough to induce Torna to take his seat. The prefect then turned back to the envoys. General Torna's point is well taken. You cannot have received word of our victory and composed any offer in so short a time. The envoy smiled a small smile. Kira noted that the envoy had yet to provide a name for himself or his 2 aides. You are correct. We have been in the city for several weeks now, awaiting the outcome of your war. If you were victorious, as our intelligence reports indicated you likely would be, then we were prepared to offer you entry into the Bajora. If you lost, then we would simply return and await a more felicitous time to add this region to the glory of the prophets.
The prophets! Torna's voice was like a sonic boom. You wish to make us part of your theocracy?
In a snippy tone that Kira recognized from certain Vedics back in her time, the envoy said, We are not a theocracy, sir. The Bajora is a democratic government of the people of this world. Our goal is to unite the planet once and for all.
Really?
Torna's tone was dubious. For too long, the envoy said, and now he was addressing the entire room, not just Torna or Natlar. We have squabbled and bickered in conflicts much like the one you just finished.
That was hardly a squabble, Torna said angrily.
True, the envoy said, sparing the general a glance. Many lives were lost, and they need not have been. For if we are united, Bajor, there would be no such conflicts. Sister need not fight against sister. Blood need not be spilled recklessly. We would all be free to follow our Pog without worrying about who rules us or who we will fight tomorrow. He turned to Natlar. I urge you, Prefect, to consider our offer. The Bajora can only bring benefit to you in these difficult times. You would have the service of our navy to guard your port. You would have the benefit of our assistance in repairing your soil.
And all we'd have to do in return is worship your prophets, yes? Torna said. A small price to pay, I'm sure.
The envoy turned to the rest of those gathered. And does this man speak for you all? Will you let one man stand between you and progress? Natlar suppressed a smile. General Torna does not speak for us all. He simply speaks loudest. A small chuckle passed around the table at that, though Torna looked even angrier at the barb, and Kira couldn't blame him. The point is, the envoy continued, you have been weakened by this conflict. True, the Lerrit have as well, but they have greater resources. The Bajora, however, have even greater resources still, and we're expanding. It's only a matter of time before we have united the entire planet. We urge you to aid in that process. The envoy went on for quite some time, outlining in more detail what joining the Bajora would involve. Kira found her attention wandering. It reminded her a bit too much of the meetings with Federation dignitaries when they carried on about the joys of joining them. Another parallel. Finally, Natlar said, You have given us much to think about. She signaled to one of the guards who was standing at the door, who sent the young girl in. We do not have the finest accommodations, but Prilla will show you to a chamber where you may refresh yourselves while we discuss your proposal. Prilla came in as the envoy nodded. We thank you for your hospitality and your indulgence, Prefect. Then he and his 2 aides followed Prilla out of the conference room. Silence descended upon the room for several seconds before Torna's booming voice predictably broke it.
You can't possibly be considering the request, can you?
Natlar sighed. Of course I am considering it, General. It would be a fool not to. Torna slammed a fist down on the table.
No, what would be foolish would be to accept their offer. We'd be trading one oppressor for another.
One of the other people at the table, an older man, said, You keep saying that, Antoso. What, you're saying the Bajora, Lerrit, and Endtree are all the same?
That's exactly what I'm saying.
And you're even more naive than I thought. Again, Torna slammed his fist on the table. Kira half expected to see a dent in the wood at this point.
I'm naive? I have been fighting for our lives out there, Morlek. Don't you dare tell me...
No one is doubting your accomplishments, Morlek said.
But the truth is we are free.
Torna looked at each person at the table as he spoke.
But we are not going to remain free if we just let someone else do exactly what Lerrit did. So many have died so that we could shape our own destiny, not so we can let someone else do the same thing. No matter who it is, Bajora, Lerrit, Endtree, we cannot let anyone direct our paths. He turned back to Morlik. You're right, Morlik. Lerrit, Endtree, and Bajora are not the same. But from our perspective, they are all outsiders, and that is what concerns me, and should concern all of us. If we are simply going to allow ourselves to be subsumed by the next power that comes along, then I have to wonder what precisely we have been fighting for all this time. Torna strode purposely toward the exit. I will abide by whatever you decide in this room, Prefect, he said as he walked. But I will not sit here and listen to any more foolish ramblings. Just remember one thing. He stopped and gave the table one final glance. Perikian Republic did not die so we could become part of the Bajora, or part of Endtree. She died so we could be free. If we are to name ourselves for her, then we should never forget what she stood for.
And with that, he left. Chapter 3. Kira found Torna 2 hours later in his quarters. He was sitting on the windowsill, staring out the window at the port. Kira noticed that his quarters were clean, which was a first. Guess that's how he spent the last 2 hours, she thought with amusement. You want the good news or the bad news? Kira asked as she entered. Torna didn't even look at her. I find it impossible to believe that there is good news. Well, there is. Natlar rejected the Bajoran offer. Shaking his head, Torna said, Amazing! I wouldn't have given them credit for thinking that clearly. Why not? Kira asked angrily. You think you're the only one who's fighting out there? Torna sighed. I sometimes wonder. He shook his head. No, of course, you're right, Ashla. I simply don't want to see everything we fought for ruined by short-sightedness. Give Natlar a little credit, Antosso. She's not about to toss everything out the window. I suppose not. Kira wasn't finished. She moved closer to Torna and went on. But give the Bajora some credit, too. What they're trying to do is important. I know you don't believe in the prophets, but what they're doing is bringing the world together. She had almost said bringing Bajor together, but that word would not be applied to the planet as a whole until after the Bajora succeeded in uniting it many years hence. Don't let a little bit of agnosticism blind you to that. Chuckling, Torna said, A little bit of agnosticism? What a wonderful way of phrasing it. I may not be the most spiritual person in the world, Ashla, but... He hesitated. Perhaps you're right. But even if I thought the Bajora were the most wonderful people in the world, I wouldn't want to become part of them. Someday, maybe. But not today. Not after all we fought for. Kira put a soothing hand on Torna's shoulder. I know, Antosso. Believe me, I know. But you can't blind yourself to a good thing just because you don't like it. I know that. He smiled. Well, at least I sometimes know that. Taking in the newly cleaned room with a gesture, Kira asked, That why you had the cleaning frenzy? Torna laughed. It was either that or punch through the walls, and I do have to live here. Wincing, Kira said, Well, actually, no, you don't. That's the bad news. The prefect wants you to relocate to the port and set up your office there to serve as a liaison to the Endtree fleet. It only took a second for Torna's face to go from amused contriteness to vicious fury. An office? Ina hasn't even asked her government's permission yet, but Natlar wants me to set up an office? She's hoping for the best, Kira said with a shrug. Besides, after your performance today, I think she wants to keep you far away from the Capitol building. Yes, he said bitterly, to keep my voice from being heard. Kira smiled. Antosso, even from the port, your voice is going to be heard. Torna whirled on her, then let out a long, hissing breath that sounded like a deflating balloon. Apt, since the crack seemed to deflate his anger. How do you do that, Ashla? Do what? All of this! I haven't done anything, Antosso. You may not think so, but you have been a most valued right hand, and one I am reluctant to lose. If I am to be exiled to Natlar Port... What? He smiled. The resolution to pass the name change had been postponed until the prefect isn't in the room, since she never let it come to a vote otherwise. In any case, if that is where I am to be sent, I want you by my side, to guard my back, and to keep me from making a complete ass of myself. Kira hesitated. Can I think about it? Of course. Let me know tomorrow. It will take me that long to pack up my own belongings and inform Lyra and the boys that we'll be moving. Moving where? Came a voice from the doorway. Kira turned to see a large, stout woman with a mane of red hair to match Torna's own, standing in the doorway to Torna's quarters. She had met the general's wife only once, but she was probably the only person who could stand up to Torna and not be killed for their trouble.
I am to be the new liaison with the Endtree fleet that will be occupying the port.
Good. The change in climate will do some good. The humidity opens your pores, you know.
She turned to Kira.
How are you, Nerys? Is the arm healing well?
Lyra was an apothecary, and the first time Kira had met her was when she'd given her a remedy to help heal her arm faster. Well enough, she said neutrally. I'd kill for a dermal regenerator, but this'll do.
I still want to know what you've done to keep your teeth so perfect.
Nothing special. Not wanting to pursue this line of questioning, she said, I need to get going and think about your offer. I'll talk to you tomorrow.
Good to see you, Lyra.
Chapter 4. Kira Nerys lay on the bunk in the barracks that she shared with a dozen other soldiers. It had been surprisingly easy to readjust to sleeping in uncomfortable beds or no beds at all. Since arriving here, whenever that was, she had either slept on cold ground or on uncomfortable beds, either way crammed into a too small space with dozens of other soldiers. Just like the good old days, millennia from now. Kira's memories of arriving in Bajor's past were hazy. She often didn't bother trying to think about it, simply accepting what her senses told her as reality. Tonight, facing the end of the conflict that had raged since she arrived here, however that happened, and the start of something new, she once again cast her mind back to see how she should proceed forward. The last thing she remembered with any clarity was that arid desert planet in the Delta Quadrant. Everywhere she looked on the ground was sand, broken very rarely by bits of plant life, and the one freshwater lake that she had made sure to land near. It was flat land, with the only variations being the curvature of the planet itself. Not even any hills or mountains or sand dunes in sight. She'd gone there and abandoned her runabout in order to block a gateway, a portal into space through which deadly theta radiation was flowing into orbit around the inhabited planet of Europa Nova in the Alpha Quadrant. Kira's actions had prevented one lethal piece of radioactive waste from going through the gateway, thus saving the lives of the Europani, as well as the task force she herself had assembled to evacuate the planet. But to do that, she'd also had to abandon her companion, the Jem'Hadar named Tyranitar, who had stayed behind to fight a Hirogen hunter, keeping him occupied while Kira blocked the gateway. After that, she couldn't recall what happened. She knew that she found a gateway on the planet where there had been none before. She knew that the theta radiation on the planet had grown to fatal levels. And she knew that she was now many thousands of years in Bajor's past, fighting in a rebellion that the history of her time had long forgotten. She wasn't even sure how long it had been since she'd arrived in this time. All she was sure of was that she no longer had the radiation sickness she'd been afflicted with, and the prophets had something to do with her sojourn to the past. Maybe. The gateways weren't built by the prophets, after all, but the Iconians. In fact, there weren't any gateways within 10 light years of the Celestial Temple. Based on the reports she'd read en route to Europa Nova, the gateways had not only come in all shapes and sizes, but types. Some even seemed to work interdimensionally, so it was quite possible that they could move through time as well. Of course, the Orb of Time had that capability too, as Kira knew from more than one first-hand experience. Still, she hadn't questioned her odyssey simply because it felt right. Once before, during the Reckoning, she had served as a vessel for the prophets. That same feeling she'd had then, she had now. Well, okay, she thought wryly. It's not exactly the same. Then I couldn't even control my own actions. But I can't shake the feeling that they're the reason I'm here, somehow. She lay awake on her pallet, listening to the sounds of the other slumbering soldiers. Some snored, some mumbled in their sleep, some simply breathed heavy. Until the Cardassians pulled out of Bajor, Kira Nerys had always slept in large groups of people, so tuning out the sounds came easily to her. In fact, when she'd first been assigned to Deep Space Nine, one of the hardest things had been learning to sleep in a room by herself. But sleep eluded her. Not because of the noise, but because she wrestled with her conscience. Fighting with the rebels had been an easy choice. Agreeing to accompany Torna to his new duties at the Natlar port was somewhat less so. On one hand, she was concerned about altering the past. On the other, very little was known about the history of this region. If the prophets had sent her here, and she felt at the core of her pog that they were involved somehow, then they'd done it for a reason. She needed to continue down the path that was set before her. Dying didn't concern her. She had accepted the reality of her own death in the Delta Quadrant. As far as she was concerned, any living she did from this point forward was a gift. That was why she had no compunction about fighting alongside Torna with weapons far more primitive, and in their own way more brutal than any she used in the Resistance. Besides, she thought, I have to believe that I'm here for a reason. There are far too many similarities to my own life for this to be a coincidence. She resolved to accept Torna's offer first thing in the morning.
Within minutes of making that resolution, she fell into a deep, peaceful slumber, unbothered by the breathing and snoring around her. To be continued on Wednesday, when I will read chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8. And then on Friday will be chapters 9, 10, 11, and 12. Tune in then. Check me out online at DeCandido.net. Read my blog at DeCandido.wordpress.com. And you can also support me at patreon.com/KRAD. If you want to get a copy of What Lay Beyond, you should be able to find it online. The ebook should still be available. I doubt you'll be able to find copies of the hardcover or the mass market paperback. In addition, Horn and Ivory is actually in Twist of Faith, which is an omnibus that collects the first 4 post-finale Deep Space Nine stories. It doesn't include the other Gateways books, but it does include my DS9 novel, Horn and Ivory, as well as the 3 prior books, Avatar books 1 and 2 by S.D. Perry, and the Section 31 novel Abyss by David Whittle and Jeffrey Lang, which sort of all those 5 stories pick up after What You Leave Behind directly, and sort of set up the status quo. That'll explain why there was a Jem'Hadar with Kira also. Thanks very much, and I'll see you on Wednesday. Please stay safe. Bye.